Italy, 1944. The Allies fight to wrest control of Italy from the Germans, while the Germans turn every ridge and mountain into a fortress.
The Germans always had a hill higher than us. They could see us coming.
Battle-hardened German troops set traps and wait for the Allied tanks to roll into them.
We would let them come close. Then, when they got very close, we would fire.
Canadian troops fight the Germans across rivers, through valleys, and up mountain ridges.
They had Italy, and they were doing their best not to give it up, and we were doing our best to get them out of it. It would be tank versus tank.
Canadian and German armor clash in the battle for Italy. Italy today, beautiful, peaceful. But for thousands of years, armies fought here. The Carthaginian general Hannibal, Attila the Hun, and Napoleon Bonaparte all struggled here to win supremacy over the Mediterranean Sea.
Italy is that great land bridge that connects three continents together. So all of the great empires that exist around the rim of the Mediterranean Sea have sought to control the Italian peninsula.
And never was the fighting more vicious or desperate than between the Allies and the Germans in the Second World War. On July 10th, 1943, thousands of Canadian troops storm ashore near Pechino on the southeast coast of the island of Sicily as part of the Allied invasion force. In a mere 6 weeks, the Allies conquer Sicily. And on the 3rd of September, they launch the invasion of the Italian mainland. 5 days later, on September 8th, 1943, Italy surrenders.
The collapse of the fascist government in Italy led to the removal of the Italian armed forces from the Second World War, forcing the Germans to backfill with their own naval forces, air forces, and ground forces to defend the south coast of Europe.
In a dramatic turnaround, Italy's former ally, Nazi Germany, decides to fight for every inch of Italian soil.
They didn't just send 60 divisions to the south coast of Europe, they sent 60 of the best divisions to stop the Allies from breaking through into the southern approaches to Germany itself.
And these well-trained, well-equipped German troops quickly discover they have a crucial and formidable new ally: the Italian landscape. Running right down the spine of the Italian boot is a central mountain range, the Apennines. Spurs of the Apennines reach out to both east and west coasts, creating a 1,000-kilometer obstacle course of narrow coastal valleys, steep ridges, and an endless series of streams and rivers.
And there were rivers everywhere, a nuisance. Every 3 miles we had another river to get over. A river every 3 miles is the worst possible tank country. But what difference does it make? That's what we were, that's what we had to do.
Exploiting every twist in the terrain, the Germans build one defensive line after another, turning over 1,000 kilometers of mountain, river, crag, and swamp into an unending battlefield.
The Germans have every advantage of terrain. There are very few avenues to advance northward in Italy. It takes a relatively small number of Germans to block all of the paths successfully.
They're in a stationary position, they're just waiting for you to come along.
The Canadians fight desperately for almost a year, including the vicious street battles in Ortona. Combat in Italy has already cost the Canadians almost 10,000 casualties. In May 1944, the Canadians finally smashed through the Gustav and Adolf Hitler lines in the Liri Valley, just 130 kilometers south of the Italian capital, Rome.
We were getting ready, quite literally, to take Rome. That was our end objective.
One of the last obstacles in the advance to Rome is the Melfa River, which cuts across the Liri Valley, 15 kilometers beyond the smashed Adolf Hitler line.
The Melfa River is a giant anti-tank ditch that bars the approaches to Rome by cutting across the Liri Valley at right angles.
The Canadians are ordered to seize the river crossings and open the road to the Eternal City. For the assault on the Melfa, the Canadian 5th Armored Division mobilizes a striking force of over 4,000 combat troops, 24 light tanks, and more than 160 Sherman medium tanks. The Sherman is the backbone of the Canadian attack. The Sherman 5 is armed with a low-velocity 75mm gun and has 51mm of frontal armor that is dangerously vulnerable to the powerful cannons on most of the German tanks. And if the Sherman is hit, it has a deadly weakness.
They called them the Bunsen burner, because when it went on fire, it really went on fire. Almost invariably, you'd lose all 5 men if the entire tank went on fire.
At the Melfa River, the Shermans and their crews will be put to a severe test. The German High Command is desperate to defend the Melfa. Its crossings are virtually the only escape route for the German soldiers, retreating north from the smashed Adolf Hitler line.
What we see in the Melfa River is a giant collision between the 26th Panzer Division that's rushing into the area to try to stabilize the German front and the Canadians that are trying to seize a crossing over the Melfa River before the Germans have a chance to turn it into a new defense line.
To defend the river crossings, the Germans field 1,000 combat troops and more than 30 tanks and assault guns, including a dozen Panther tanks. May 24th, 1944, the assault on the Melfa begins. The Shermans of the British Columbia Dragoons race towards the river crossings.
I was very apprehensive before we went into battle every day. I used to try and cover up by telling funny stories and everybody would laugh. You know, it's a tense moment before you go in. But once I was in action, I was too busy fighting to get to be tense. The infantry went in and fighting their way across. And they couldn't get up the other side because of the machine guns, and there were machine gun nests everywhere. And there were tanks. They were up the cliff, and a couple of them were already down, giving the infantry a hard time. Apart from the artillery, then we were the solution. There was a 12-foot drop from the countryside down to the river. And we went down this 12-foot cliff to help them. It was a hell of a drop. And the Germans were trying their best to kill us. Shells are coming in like raindrops. Everybody's firing, the dust goes up everywhere, and it becomes a real mess. They came down their 12-foot cliffs and they met us on the beach. It would be tank versus tank.
The Canadians at the Melfa are the first in the West to do combat with a deadly Panther. The Panther weighs a formidable 45 tons and has sloped frontal armor 80 millimeters thick. Its long-barreled, high-velocity 75mm gun can easily cut through a Sherman.
We
We had no intimation whatsoever that they had moved Panthers down into Italy. The total shock to us. The Panthers were much slower than we were, but our shells just bounced off them. So they were real competition. They would go on fire same as we would if we hit them properly. If you were lucky enough to be able to put your shell right between the turret and the hull, where there was a hole, you could get in there. It's nice when the tank is firing at you, and they were, and you fire back and he blows up. That's a very good feeling, except that there are plenty of other tanks around. You don't sit around glorying, you're looking at the other tanks. I saw a couple of tanks go, but that was what you were there for.
At the end of the battle, virtually all the German tanks have been destroyed, and the Canadians are across the Melfa.
The German reinforcements are decisively defeated in and around the Melfa River, making it impossible to defend Rome.
By June 1st, the Canadians are almost in Rome, the Eternal City, and the grand prize of the campaign.
We were 26 miles away from Rome, and we figured we were going to be in Rome in about an hour, and we were told to stop. We found out why. The Americans wanted to take Rome, except it was no particular glory because the Germans didn't defend Rome.
Films taken by Italian anti-fascists show the evacuation of Rome. The streets were deserted as the Nazis left.
The Americans enter Rome on June 4th, but their glory and the headlines don't last long. 2 days later is D-Day, June 6th, 1944. As Allied troops land on the beaches in Normandy, and the decisive battle for France and Western Europe begins, suddenly the Italian campaign becomes a sideshow.
We had been in action for about 11 months before D-Day. So we thought it was kind of funny, these guys who were just coming into battle now, swanking about it. So we called ourselves the D-Day Dodgers. We dodged the D-Day by fighting for 11 months before it.
But even as France is invaded, the Germans redouble their desperate fight for Italy. And the Canadians are now about to face some of their bloodiest battles ever. After crossing the Melfa River and with Rome in friendly hands, Canadian and Allied forces rush northward, up the Italian peninsula, heading towards the core of Italy's industrial and agricultural power. In the vanguard of the advance are Canadian tank crews and their Sherman tanks. It will not be a walkover. The German armies are determined to defend northern Italy to the last.
North Italy is the breadbasket and industrial heartland of Italy as a whole. And that industrial heartland has been integrated fully into the German war economy. It is essential if the Germans are going to carry out their strategy for 1944 and 45 to maintain control of that industrial and agricultural heartland.
In the summer of 1944, the Germans are desperately building a defensive line in the north to protect the Po Valley, the supposedly invincible Gothic Line. But the Gothic Line is not yet complete, so the German High Command decides to delay the Allies at the so-called Trasimene Line. The line lies 160 kilometers north of Rome, and where it confronts the Canadians, it extends across an 8-kilometer gap between Lake Trasimene and Lake Chiusi. Between the two lakes, the Germans have improvised a 3-kilometer deep, zigzagging swath of dug-in strongpoints and machine gun posts.
The Germans choose the Lake Trasimene battlefield because any Allied drive that's going to reach the Po Valley has to come through those rolling foothills west of Lake Trasimene.
The rolling ridges and high ground offer the Germans ideal terrain for their cat-and-mouse delaying action.
The Germans always had a hill higher than us. They could see us coming.
June 21st, 1944. Canadian tanks of the Ontario Regiment go into action against German panzers.
He was in a sunken road, and all I could see was his turret and the gun sticking away out there. Him facing me with that gun was really no contest. It never is. If he gets a direct shot onto you, he can put a hole through you anyway. He seemed to try to want to get up out of that road, maybe get at me. The gun was up here, like at quite an angle. It was just like waving a chimney at you. It looked so darn long. He tried to get up, but he couldn't make it. If he got out of there, I was facing that gun head on. I shot 2 or 3 shots at him. I think I hit him. The only chance I had knocking him out was get him broadside. Their side armor wasn't as good as their front armor. Their front armor is very thick and well slanted. He just about disappeared about that time, and he went into some trees there. And I didn't see him from then on.
After 2 days of fighting, the tanks of the Ontario Regiment successfully smash through the German defenses and push ahead north along the shores of Lake Trasimene. 5 kilometers to the west, the tanks of the Three Rivers Regiment sit at their start line, waiting to enter the battle.
We were scheduled to start at 7 o'clock in the morning. They forgot to tell us the starting time had been changed. So we rolled out of our tank park and up the road to take position, only to find it was behind the German lines. So the Germans closed in behind us, and then they completely cut us off. As we moved forward with Major Johnson, we got a call on the radio from Captain Hunter, who said that he was being attacked from the rear. And Johnson said, "That's impossible." I said, "Well, if it's impossible, they just knocked out 7 tanks." After Major Johnson told Hunter that he couldn't understand why he was getting hit from the rear, his tank got hit.
Now surrounded by Germans and far beyond infantry support, the Canadian tankers hunker down to prepare for a long fight.
We were being shelled, and we hit a bomb crater, and went into the bomb crater into what you call a turret down position. The land was fairly flat, and we were on a mold and could see what was going on. The crew commander, he saw the Panther. It was around 500 yards away from us. For a Panther or a Tiger tank, that was nothing. They had the long barrel on it, and they could outrange us. Well, our tank had an HE, a high explosive, in the breech. I said, "Leave it in. I'll use it as a tracer, as a marker." My job was to make sure I picked up the target and fire at it. And I was lucky enough to hit the Panther tank. We never knocked out a Panther tank with a Sherman. You'd never do it. But we had hit the turret ring just below the turret, which prevented the tank from turning.
After immobilizing the Panther, the remaining tanks of the Three Rivers Regiment hold out against repeated counterattacks for more than 7 hours until they are relieved.
You go into those things with the idea that you're invincible, that regardless of what happens, they're not going to get you.
But the day has been a costly one.
We lost 13 of the 15 tanks that went into action that day. Our regiment never gave up an inch. We didn't back up. We held our position. And we never gave up a position once we took it.
The relatively unknown battle at Lake Trasimene actually cost regiments in 1st Canadian Armoured Brigade some of their heaviest losses of the war. But 1st Canadian Armoured Brigade is considered to be the most effective, best trained tank brigade of all the Allied forces in Italy. And it becomes essential to the fight for the rolling hills west of Lake Trasimene.
The Germans retreat northward toward the formidable Gothic Line, the last German bastion protecting the Po Valley and Italy's industrial heartland. In 1 week, the Canadians have vaulted through the Trasimene line. They're now considered shock troops.
The Canadians were central to all of the major Allied assaults in the Italian campaign, and for that reason, the Germans understood wherever the Canadians popped up, that's where the point of Allied main effort would be.
Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, Smiling Albert, the German commander in Italy, is determined to know where the Canadians are headed next. If he knows where the Canadians are, Kesselring can be almost certain that that is where the Allies intend to assault the Gothic Line.
They figure where the first div is going to be, that's where the breakout's going to be. And it usually was.
August 1944. The Canadians know that their actions are being anxiously watched by the Germans, and so it is in secret that they transfer to the Adriatic front and prepare to attack the Gothic Line.
Allied commanders wanted to concentrate their best troops, their most powerful armored and artillery formations, to the weakest part of the Gothic Line, and so they transfer 1st Canadian Corps secretly across the Apennines to stage behind the Folia River to deliver the main assault on the Gothic Line.
The Canadians move from their position near Perugia, over 200 kilometers through the mountains, to their assembly point, just inland on the Adriatic coast.
The decision to move the Canadian Corps across the Apennines was a tremendous engineering and transport feat. The 5th Canadian Armoured Divisional Engineers actually had to build a road for their armoured vehicles that is still a well-used truck road to this day.
Almost 11,000 vehicles, including 650 tanks, rumble through the mountains. For the assault on the Gothic Line, the Canadians have 10,000 troops and over 260 Sherman tanks. And they aim to exploit to the fullest the Sherman's greatest strength.
The biggest thing was our maneuverability. The Sherman tank was a great tank as far as that part is concerned. But we needed the mobility for obvious reasons.
The Adriatic sector of the Gothic Line consists of an anti-tank ditch, river barriers that run at right angles across the front, barbed wire entanglements, extensive minefields.
But what this section of the line lacks is enough German troops to properly defend it.
On the morning of August 31st, the German reinforcements are being rushed in from other parts of Italy now that the Germans know where the main Allied effort is coming. There's an awareness in Allied headquarters and Canadian headquarters that they've got to get high into the hills and take the German depth positions before the German reinforcements arrive.
The Canadians will cross the Folia Valley, heading towards the heights of Point 204, near the town of Tomba di Pesaro.
The Canadians understand that the key to their section of the Gothic line are the heights around Tomba di Pesaro. The British Columbia Dragoons are supposed to attack up on those heights with a supporting battalion of infantry. That battalion isn't ready, so they make the decision to go alone. It's a costly decision. It means that they have to drive through a German anti-tank gun screen and thick concentrations of German artillery fire.
Even without reinforcements, the Germans are ready for the Canadians.
The worst part was the fact that they was entrenched in there and were waiting for us.
On the neighboring ridges on both sides of them, German anti-tank guns, machine guns, mortars, and artillery are working to stop them and pick off a large number of BCD Shermans, toppling some down the ridge side and picking off others on the crest of the ridge itself.
Before reaching the German lines, the Shermans must cross a minefield.
We lost one tank, hit one of these mines, and poof. What they would do is knock off the track. And of course, it was no good after that.
The British Columbia Dragoons are attacking up a ridge towards Point 204. The Dragoons make rather skillful use of the crest of the ridge itself. To expose themselves on the crest itself means certain death. So when at all possible, they keep the vehicles on the right side of the crest and shield themselves from the German anti-tank guns to the west.
Anti-tank guns, either side, they were firing at us.
Some aren't able to do it. At some points on the top of that ridge, it's impossible to stay on the right-hand side. You have to expose yourself across the peak, and at those times, those tanks are picked off by 88s.
That 88 millimeter, that was a powerful, deadly thing.
A number of tanks actually make it to Point 204.
And that's when we saw the big Panther tank. Only hit we got was just a glancing blow off the side of the tank. Armoured, the noise inside was quite loud. It was facing us, and when I saw us, all three of us coming after them, it started to turn. But it didn't get very far. Crew commander said, "Fire it well." So I'm slamming the shells in, and the gun is firing away. In with another one. We hit a broadside, and in the turret.
Once the Canadians carve out a toehold on Point 204, they've effectively cracked their finger into the door of the Gothic line.
The Germans begin a massive withdrawal. The supposedly invincible Gothic line has been smashed.
After their victory in the Gothic line, the Canadians thought the war with Germany just might be over. They assumed that the Germans were retreating from the Gothic line and were about to abandon all of Italy. In fact, at that moment, German reinforcements were rushing to restore the front and keep the Allies from breaking into the Po Valley and setting up a new line of defense around a place called Coriano. And the heaviest of the fighting was about to break out.
September 1944. The Allies are on the verge of breaking through into the Italian north. They plan a massive push along the Adriatic coastal plain. But first, they must clear German positions that overlook the coast, near the hilltop town of Coriano.
The town of Coriano lies atop a ridge that bars the Allied approach northward to the Po Valley. And the ridge itself is an excellent place for a defensive position.
Allied command believes the Coriano Ridge is vulnerable.
They thought it was going to be a cakewalk through Coriano.
But the Canadians soon discover that Coriano is anything but lightly defended. The Germans throw in every available elite unit, including the Canadians' old foe from Ortona, the 1st Parachute Division.
We found the parachute divisions were the worst ones of all for us, because they would never give up.
Ich weiß nicht, was die Gefangenen,
I had heard some Canadian prisoners say,
kanadische Gefangene, das habe ich auch erfahren.
the Paras are very tough.
The Paras are very hard, haben die gesagt.
So, they said we were very tough.
Very hard.
So we started out into the valley, and we no sooner got over the Visaño Ridge than they started whaling hell out of us.
I was the artillery observer for the 11th Company of the 1st Parachute Division, and I had 2 radio operators with me.
In Region war das.
All of a sudden, we heard tanks from the front.
Von vorne. Und da haben wir geguckt und da sahen wir, also
So we looked,
ich habe
and I counted 50 tanks.
50 Panzer gezählt. 50. Wenn wir mit dem Funk
After we had given an order by radio,
kam innerhalb
it took
von
about 10 minutes until some artillery arrived.
Artillerie.
The Canadian advance is totally exposed to the fire of German guns.
We were out there bare naked.
Auf die Panzer und dann haben
And when the first ones caught on fire,
Feuer und
the other ones turned around.
2 B Squadron tanks from the 8th Hussars make a break for the bottom of the hill.
When we got down there, Brewster's tank and our tank got there about the same time. And we rubbed against one another. And we straddled this dry creek bed. Well, it was a natural tank trap, really. We couldn't get out of there.
The stranded B Squadron tanks are assisted by the tanks of A Squadron, positioned on the ridge above them. A Squadron lays down a smokescreen, giving the men of B Squadron the cover they need to abandon their tanks and escape on foot.
By the grace of God, we hit our lines, so we got away with it. None of our crew even got a scratch there. I feel I was very lucky to get out of that thing.
The Germans successfully repel the Canadian attack of September the 4th.
We fought off those attacks. They did not get through.
But the cost to the Germans is great. In spite of the huge loss of men and equipment, the Germans are ordered to hold.
man hat seine Pflicht getan und
We just did our duties
hat geglaubt, dass wir vielleicht
and kept on believing that we would get out of there okay.
einigermaßen davonkommen.
September 13th. The Germans face a second Canadian attack on Coriano Ridge.
In the second battle for Coriano, 15 Hussar Shermans penetrate into the center of town, assuming that the Germans have started to abandon Coriano Ridge. In fact, they find that the Germans are intent on clinging to Coriano at all costs. Those 15 Hussar Shermans reach the town square and meet an ambush force of German Tigers, Panzer IVs, and infantry.
Wir lassen die kommen.
We would let them come close, without firing at them.
Und erst wenn sie
Then, when they got very close, we would fire.
And now the Shermans must face the most dreaded tank in the German arsenal, the fearsome Tiger. The 57-ton Tiger is the jewel of Germany's panzer force. At 100 millimeters, its frontal armor is twice as thick as the Sherman's. And its 88 millimeter gun is much more powerful than the 75 millimeter cannon on the Sherman.
There was some kind of a weapon, Tiger tank. Shells just bounced off them.
They engage in a violent close-quarter battle in the town square itself. A number of Canadian tanks are hit.
The Canadians were very hard pressed. Even though they outnumbered us by far.
And in order to escape, the Hussars actually have to tow their wrecks out of the way.
Under heavy fire, the Shermans retreat from Coriano. For the remainder of the day, their tank guns shell the Germans from the outskirts of town. The next morning, they mount another assault.
The whole of 5th Canadian Armored Division regroups and goes back into Coriano. By this point, the German tanks inside Coriano have been wrecked by Canadian artillery.
After a day and night of vicious, pitiless struggle, Coriano and its ridge are finally in Canadian hands. Just on the horizon, the Po Valley beckons. The men call it the Promised Land. After the battle for Coriano, the Allies are finally on the edge of the vast Po Valley. Being flat, the valley looks like ideal tank country.
When the Canadians finally broke out into the Po Valley, many of them thought that for the first time in this war, they were going to be able to fight a battle without the Germans looking down on them. Tankers had been dreaming of the day when they'd be able to use their tanks in a breakout role and chase the Germans back to the Alps. Unfortunately, that was not going to be the case.
The desperate German fight at Coriano had a clear aim. The Germans were waiting for the season to change. Autumn weather and rain will be the Germans' greatest ally in defending the Po Valley.
Po Valley is a tanker's paradise in the summer dry weather. But because of all the rivers and irrigation canals that cut across it, once the fall rains arrive, it's a tanker's nightmare. Once it starts to rain heavily in September and October of 1944, the Po Valley filled with water. Any attempt to move off-road means that a 33-ton Sherman tank is going to bog down to its axles almost immediately. Tanks become irrelevant.
You thought it was going to be easy, but it didn't turn out that easy.
Mud makes coordinated cross-country tank attacks almost impossible. The Germans dig in, and the Allied advance slows to a crawl. Both sides hunker down in the rain and the mud. For almost 2 months, the stalemate lasts.
It's not until the very end of 1944 that we see tanks once again employed in an off-road role to play a leading part in any major battle.
Finally, the Italian winter arrives. The ground freezes up, and tanks once more become mobile.
The next task is going to be to break out across the Po Valley and chase what they think is going to be a German evacuation from Italy.
But the Germans have no intention of evacuating Italy. In fact, they plan to fight for every inch, including a bulge in their line south of Lake Camacchio. The German position near the town of Sant Alberto, on the south shore of Lake Camacchio, is a mortal danger to the Allies' right flank. The Canadians prepare to eliminate that threat.
The Canadian mission at the Battle of Lake Camacchio is to destroy the German forces south of the lake and set the conditions for the final liberation drive in the spring of 1945.
January 2nd, 1945. Canadian tanks go into action.
5th Canadian Armoured Division uses 2 of its armoured regiments. They wait until there's been several successive nights of frost to freeze the ground firm. Because they know that German anti-tank defenses are only set up to cover the roads, because for the last 3 months, no Allied tank has been able to drive off-road. After a couple of days of frost, when the ground's firm enough to carry the weight of a Sherman, these Canadian Shermans break out across the frozen ground.
Frost-hardened ground is not their only ally. The Shermans have been fitted with track grousers to aid the advance.
The track grouser extends the width of the Sherman track and enables it to travel on softer ground.
Additional pieces attached to the sides of the track links. Grousers add more than 10 centimeters to the width of the tank track, thus spreading the weight of the tank and making it less likely it will sink into soft ground or break through the frost layer. As the Canadians advance across the frozen ground, they come under fire from a German ambush. A group of anti-tank guns and Panthers begin to knock out the tanks of the 8th Hussars. Sergeant Daniel McCaskill, crew commander of one of the Shermans, acts quickly. He stops his tank and opens fire on the German positions. As he exchanges shell fire with the Germans, the rest of his squadron continues to advance. McCaskill's Sherman single-handedly knocks out 4 anti-tank guns and a Panther, while sustaining no damage himself. With the Shermans safely through the ambush zone, they continue their advance towards Lake Camacchio, leaving the German defenses in flames.
The Canadians have penetrated past any of the German defenses that can stop them and race to Lake Camacchio.
When the Canadians enter Sant Alberto, completely sealing off the southern shore of Lake Camacchio, they have taken 600 enemy prisoners and counted at least 300 enemy dead.
Lake Camacchio constitutes the last big battle for Canada in the Italian campaign. The Italian campaign is the longest fought by the Canadian Army in the Second World War. And it was tremendously successful at drawing in and tying down some of the best formations in the German Army.
We really weren't expected to win the war. Our job was to take the strength out of Europe. And in view of the fact that there were from 30 to 40 divisions, German divisions sent to fight in Italy, we did a great job in taking strength away. And of course, we were causing tremendous casualties, which they had to reinforce, and they were using tanks and they were using ammunition. So we were sapping a lot of strength out of Europe.
The Italian campaign saw some of the most famous armored regiments in Canadian history earn their spurs and prove their ability in the Italian landscape. to win some of the most important Canadian tank victories of the Second World War.
Each Canadian victory was a step in the liberation of Italy. And many Italians, like those who live near what was once the Gothic Line, still remember, even today.
The Italians in that area remember the Canadian victory at Point 204 as a key point in the story of their liberation from German occupation. The Italians built the monument at Point 204 in tribute to their Canadian liberators, with their own money and their own labor. It's a unique monument in Europe in that sense.
The memorial's inscription reads, "Here the heroic deeds of the 1st Canadian Corps breached the imposing German defenses, with the loss of over 1,000 lives, for the freedom of Italy and peace in Europe. In witness to, and as a warning for future generations." The Gothic Line was just one battle in the 20 long months the Canadians fought to liberate Italy.
That success came at a heavy price in Canadian lives.
93,000 Canadians served in Italy. More than 20,000 were wounded. Nearly 6,000 died.
Those are brave men.
We didn't think we were heroes. I was a lucky guy to survive. Each year I go to the memorial service for the 23 of my synagogue that got killed in action.
I guess I'm lucky to be where I am. All my buddies in the regiment are all dead. And that's not a very nice thing to even think about. They were excellent people, excellent soldiers.
We did what we had to do, and what we were trying to do was prevent the Germans from taking over the whole world, and we succeeded.
It was really our baptism of fire.